Welcome back to Case Studies. I'm so excited for this episode. It hits near and dear to my heart. We're with Astrid Tuminez, who is the president of UVU, which is the school that I dropped out of. And
shame on you. Come back, finish your degree.
and Astrid is a special leader. Like I think I've met so many leaders, and you have this unique gift of like just almost joy, like a child. Like you get so excited, and it's like almost impossible not for like people just to be endeared to you as the leader because you love so much. You pour so much of yourself into that school. And I've always admired that, whether it's being at the wrestling matches or whether it's being at the basketball games. Like from the very first day that you got there, you just embraced the school and kind of what it's about so much. And so I think you're just an incredible leader. So excited to hear your story.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Yeah, and thanks for carving out the time. So, Astrid, I want to go back to the beginning, like where the origin story, where did it all begin?
Yeah. So a lot of people ask me about my origin story because I think it's unusual here in Utah. I'm not from here. I was born and raised in the Philippines. I was born in a rice farming village. And when I was 2 years old, my mother decided that her 6 children at the time, she later had a total of 8 kids. She decided that our opportunities were really limited in the village. And so she moved us to the city. And the only place that we could afford to live in was the slums of Iloilo City. So that's where I grew up. And later on, when I was 10 years old, I joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which led me to Utah, i.e., I began to dream about leaving the Philippines and going to another place to pursue my studies. And I started college at the University of the Philippines. I got a government scholarship. And then later on, I went to Brigham Young University where I finished my undergraduate degree and then went on to Harvard and MIT. So the origin story, if you will, is, one of an immigrant, one of a dreamer, one of a person who just believed in magic, that life could be magical.
So expand on that. Like talk about, your mom, and you reference your mom. Was
Yes.
your dad in the home? Was it mom and dad, or was it just your mom?
So my parents split up when I was 5 years old.
So your mom was a single mom? With
No,
8?
she wasn't. She left. So my dad was a single dad with 7 kids, in the little hut on stilts in the sea in the Philippines. And my father, interestingly, was someone who didn't know how to parent. So he worked as a tax collector in the wet market in Iloilo City. It's called Central Market. And he earned literally less than $50 a month, and there were 7 of us. My mother later had my brother in Manila, another child. And so I grew up in this broken home, really with no adult supervision. My father didn't know what to do with 7 kids. When my youngest sibling was only 18 months, we left her home alone every day while we all went to school, and we'd come back at noon hoping she'd still be there and hadn't fallen into the sea. I don't even know how that worked because I'm a mother of 3, and you have no water, no electricity, you had no food, you had no soap, you had no toothpaste, you had nothing. And so I think that's the beginning of what I call my own magical thinking. In those circumstances, your brain has to work a different way. Your brain has to become really imaginative to see what else is out there. What can I do? Where can I go? And the thing that I have to mention is so important is that when I was 5 years old, Catholic nuns from an order called the Daughters of Charity, they originated from France. They were doing catechism and service in the slums and found my family and invited us to go to their school for free. It's a convent school. And that's what utterly changed the trajectory of my life. So that's why I'm a big believer in education. And the story lends itself very well to running a university because education, frees the mind.
Oh, I mean, like I'm listening to this story and I'm thinking of like the statistic probability of you making it out. And it feels impossible. I'm just,
Yes,
you know what
yes.
I mean?
Yeah, somebody said to me 1 in a billion.
No,
Not even 1 in a billion.
it feels like that. It feels like, and do you ever sit back and just wonder, like, why me? And like, how did God have like this plan for me? Like it really is like this magical, even just to get out. It's one thing to get out, but then, to expand and go do what you've done, it just feels like there's something bigger at work.
Yes, that is an interesting question. And I think for me, philosophically and theologically, I believe in a higher power. And I believe that all human beings can access that higher power, whatever your faith is. And even when you don't have faith, sometimes it will whack you in the face.
Yeah.
And I do believe, not so much that, I was predestined for anything, but that I sought that guidance. And I was always a person of faith. I am a person of faith today. I was born and raised Catholic at first, very, very devout, very religious, raised by Catholic nuns. So you can imagine that I had a convent mindset.
Yeah.
And it was all about, Jesus Christ and God and doing good and making judgments early on in my life about what was good and what wasn't good. Actually, a lot of very black and white thinking that I no longer subscribe to as an adult. And then when I became a Latter-day Saint, it was very empowering at the time to be taught, that I am a child of God, that my potential is actually limitless. And so those things, and I'm very prayerful, and it's funny, I pray out loud all the time. My kids sometimes like tease me and they respond as if they were God when they hear me. And I'm like, shut up, kids. But, I pray all the time. I'm a very prayerful person. I admire Muslims because they pray 5 times a day. I think that all the time we should be aware that we are mortal, that we could die any moment. And because of that, the awareness of my mortality keeps me kind of humble and tethered to the fact that in many ways I am ordinary. But then in other ways, because I believe that great things are possible, I try to pursue what is possible and kind of think about, what are my talents? What do I have to give? How can I be more honest? How can I make other people more honest, the people that I work with? So I know the question was more about, divine.
No, please keep
plan.
going. I mean, it's like.
But I really believe there are divine plans.
You're truly like just like speaking to my heart, like the way you're describing the way that you see the world and the way you think about the world, and this principle of stewardship and this principle of, we all have talents, and we're also stewards of what we do with this beautiful life that we were given. And, I can see it. I can see the physical results of a philosophy that you're discussing. And it feels like it's something that you've been developing from like a young age, from a very young age, being taken in by nuns.
Yes.
To, joining the church and dreaming about leaving this other side of the world. And so talk to me about the transition of, were you always good academically? Were you always gifted academically and that was your vehicle, or that was your way out, was just your ability to excel?
Yes. So when the nuns first let me go to their school, I was not academically gifted. I was an ignoramus. I couldn't spell my name. I couldn't tell the difference between the circle that's a 0 and the 100 that's 100. I couldn't. And so the amazing thing was to discover when my teachers taught me to read, they actually didn't even let me go to first grade. They called me a visitor. And the school was set up. It was called the free department because it was for poor children. The real school was across the street, and they were for rich kids. They had maids, they had drivers. And we were seated, my first day of school, from the smartest to the dumbest. So there were 6 rows of chairs. The smartest one was in the first seat, first row. The dumbest was in the 6th seat, 6th row. And that's where they put me.
That feels so archaic. It feels just
no,
like
it was name and shame. The shaming culture was alive and well. But it was very disciplined. Like, we couldn't laugh out loud. They inspected our nails on Monday mornings. I had never thought as a kid from the slums that your nails should be clean. So suddenly I was being exposed to people who behave differently.
Yeah.
They didn't cuss. And in my neighborhood, everybody said the worst cuss words every day. And suddenly I was exposed to this set of people who were really different. And then I learned to read and write. And so the learning to read, we know today in America, by the way, the 3rd grade reading level is a gigantic predictor of incarceration, the chances that you will get jailed someday.
Yeah.
And so learning to read for me was a superpower that just blew my mind open, because suddenly I discovered language. Not only did I discover language, I discovered worlds, that I could pick up a magazine and learn about New York City, or I could read all the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew and learn that you could be a detective, or read Dr. Seuss and realize that you could form words that didn't even exist. So for me, the discovery of language and a love of reading, which to this day is a central part of my life. I'm always reading 10 different books at any given time. That opened the world to me. And because I was good at it, I actually got promoted to 2nd grade without going to 1st grade. So then suddenly I also developed self-esteem.
So you, like, once that unlocked,
yeah,
and people saw your potential, that at a very young age kind of gave you the belief that, hey, I am special. I can do something. Yeah.
And I displaced the first girl in the first row.
You took her out.
Within less than half a year, I took her out. And that felt so good. So the other side was discovering that I love competing.
You like competing.
I realized that I love to compete, but still super insecure. People look at me today and think, oh, you're so confident. Into my 20s, I would want to puke before giving a speech.
You're so nervous.
Because I was so nervous, and my imposter syndrome was really strong, and I didn't believe that I was as good as anybody else. When I went to Harvard, I thought, wow, they're all smarter than I, because I'd gone to BYU, and frankly, the kids who went to Princeton or Haverford, they were better prepared than I. At BYU, I wasn't taught to really debate a lot and question ideas. They were better read. They knew the literature. So I constantly had that imposter syndrome, but it also led me to certain good habits. Like, I will over-prepare because people are smarter. I will try to look good because other people are richer. It made me think about these things. What can I do to compensate for the things that I never had or were never given to me, that I could not take for granted? And that's really great for UVU, for Utah Valley University, because I arrived at this university. It had been a technical college. People were saying, oh, I just go to UVU. And everything I had learned about life and career was so applicable to UVU. Yes, you are a younger university. Yes, you don't have as many resources, but you are the most exciting and the most interesting. And therefore, how do we bank on that? How do we turn that into different habits and different ways of thinking that make us better than we even think we are, that make us capable of achieving things we can't even dream of today, right? So I feel like the life experience was so good to coming to a university like UVU.
We were big Matt Holland fans.
Yeah.
I think he did such a phenomenal job with that university. And when he was transitioning out, I remember we were kind of like, not nervous, but curious on how they were going to have somebody fill in his shoes. You know what I mean? Because he was such a dynamic, talented leader and got a lot of stuff done. And I remember when they hired you, and I was so intrigued just to see how you would fit. And hearing some of like your backstory, it feels like I can't think of somebody that would embrace us just because of the humble beginnings. Like, I think about, for me going to UVU, I went there for baseball. I went there for athletics. But it was such a great opportunity, that school. It was evolving, it was growing, it was transitioning. And I went there the other day. I got asked to speak at the entrepreneurship program. And it was the first time where I was almost shook a little bit, where I walked into this new building and state-of-the-art avionics and the professionalism of the team that met me. And it was the most impressive experience. I do it at BYU. I do it kind of consistently when people ask. And it was better than those other schools. Like the facilities, the professionalism of the team that brought me there, the product after having it, posted. And I was like, this school has things going on, like they're cutting edge. And so it's fun to see. Yeah, it's fun to see your vision taking place. And there's usually a lag from the vision to the finished product. You know what I mean? That's just how it works. So I don't want to get off too far the topic because I want to dig in on this story. So you transition. What was the point where you went to school on scholarship? Did you go to Catholic school all the way through high school?
All the way through junior year.
Okay.
And the Philippines at the time only had K-10. We didn't have K-12 at the time. So only through 9th grade. And then I went because I became Mormon, there was a falling out with the nuns. They were so hurt. They were so heartbroken. I mean, seriously, they believed, I was going to go to hell, something like that. And I don't blame them, right? It's very natural.
Was that what? Talk a little bit about the conversion. Like what was the experience because obviously that was a very important part of your life, education and school.
Yes.
Outside of religion, it was very important. Talk to me about kind of that process of conversion.
Yeah, so the conversion, actually, it was first my two oldest sisters. I think they were 16 and 15 or 17 and 16 at the time. And they joined the church. And then, then my other sister and my mother in Manila, and then another sibling. And the sibling that I follow, the two of us, were the most hardened against it. Meaning that we were not interested because, we loved the Catholic Church. We loved going to Mass. We loved going to confession. And also we drank beer as little children. And so we're not interested in a religion that's going to outlaw beer.
The missionaries were kind of intrigued. You've got a 10-year-old and a 12-year-old that are
from the slums, and they spoke perfect English.
From the slums that don't want to join the church because they love Mass and they love drinking beer.
Yes.
And that's a problem.
Yes.
I think it's like a missionary. I went on a mission. I would be intrigued with that story.
And these were, young men from Utah. And so they would never give up on us. So one set of missionaries would be transferred. Another set would come and they'd already heard about us. And then it's very funny so they never gave up. And then finally this set of missionaries, Elder Jenkins and Elder Allred, and it was in particular this Elder Jenkins, Scott Jenkins, and he was just, he wasn't really teaching us, he was playing with us. And I just thought, oh, he's so nice, so kind. And so then finally I wanted to listen, right? And then I would, have smart aleck questions all the time. And at that time, missionaries had this flip chart with pictures. I would make fun of the pictures. I'd be like the guy who was supposed to be repenting, I thought, he just lost his coin in the grass. He's just frustrated. He's kneeling in the grass. So, but then I really loved the plan of salvation. That was sort of the story that got me. And different people, will find things in the church. That's why they join. So for me, it was the plan of salvation that, you can have a really purposeful life. And so I got baptized, and it was really, really hard for the nuns. And then we tried to still have a great relationship with them, but then they had us pay. They wanted us to pay, and we couldn't really afford it. And so my last year of high school, I had to move to Manila and be with my mother. And so I went to Manila without a transcript, without any money in my pocket. And this is just a true miracle. My mother knew I needed to finish high school because what would happen to me if I didn't finish high school? So we went to this Methodist school that she had heard of. And we just walked in there and we asked to meet with somebody. And we were given the guidance counselor of the entire high school. And we went to him, and My mother was a woman who was never afraid to ask on behalf of her children. So we went to him and we said, we have no money, we have no transcript, but this girl needs to finish high school. And interestingly, he said yes. He said yes, you can come. We can wait for your money and your transcript. And so I was able to finish high school in this Methodist school, and they were kind of evangelical and it was praise the Lord all the time. I kind of love that about it too. And that's how I finished high school, and I was able to get a scholarship to the best university, the University of the Philippines. For the first time in my life, I had cash. Every month they gave me cash. And suddenly, my whole world just changed. So now I forget the original question, the conversion. So that was the conversion, and then schooling.
Think about coming from like those humble beginnings, and you're talking about imposter syndrome. That's always got to kind of be there of like, you see these kids that didn't have that had the opposite, that always had money, that always had the private schools, that always had kind of all of the resources. And for you, it's kind of coming almost from the other side of the tracks.
Absolutely.
If you will. And so there's, you get older and you care less what people think.
Yes.
But when you're younger, you care a lot.
You care a lot.
You know what I mean? And that had to have been so hard.
Yeah.
Transitioning where you have the hope and you've got like the aspiration, but you also have the doubt and the fear. And I think those are like all of us, if we're honest with ourselves, are at different levels of that journey of trying to like be comfortable with who we are.
Yeah. And in a way, it's hard to overcome, when you've always felt poor or plain. Also in the Philippines, I was very plain because, my nose was flat and my skin was brown. And in the Philippines, you're beautiful if you have really white skin and a tall nose.
Interesting.
And so you're poor. It's like Jane Eyre. There's that line in Jane Eyre where she says, I'm poor, I'm plain, but I have a heart. And so as you become an adult, and this is true of everybody, I think you have to, it's something you develop over time. What are the stories you're going to tell yourself?
Yeah.
There's especially a lot of indignity to being poor. So I will never romanticize poverty. There's just a lot of indignity.
Yeah.
I mean, you're a girl, you can't buy period products.
Yeah.
So there's indignity and you always look, ugly. And
so there's the dean of Harvard. There's a guy named, I think he's still the dean, Nitin Nori.
In the business school, yes. Nitin Noria.
And he was doing a podcast with David Solomon at Goldman Sachs. And he was talking about that same idea of dignity.
Yeah.
And he was talking about capitalism in the developing worlds. And he shared this quote, and I just have not, I'm always trying to listen and learn, but stuff doesn't stick like this quote, and I just haven't been able to unlearn it. And he basically said the truest form of dignity that you can give to another human being is to teach them to be economically self-reliant.
Mm-hmm.
And I think about that, and I think about your story and the indignity of not being economically self-reliant and what comes with that.
Yes.
And to be able to transcend that and to be able to have feminine products or to be able to pay your own rent or to be able to, and the dignity that does give you and the pride that it gives you.
Mm-hmm.
And it, that transition, is just so important. You think about how many people, the number of people that are transitioning from, poverty to, being able to self-sustain, and how capitalism and technology and all those things have sped that along.
Yeah. I think foundational to that is education.
Education. Yep.
Setting aside capitalism, and education is the first thing that allows you to say, I can go out there, get a job. I have some skills. I have some competencies So I think that's why as a university president, we're really quite focused at UVU on jobs.
Yeah, on skills.
Because above and look, I was a Russian literature major. So part of me is a romantic. I'm not about jobs or, capitalism. I'm about romanticism. I love poetry. I love novels. But I also realized from a young age that I can cry over poetry, but I need to go buy my groceries, right? It's both ends.
Yeah, there's that extreme of the artistic and the dreamer.
Yeah.
with the reality and where the rubber meets the road, and
Yeah.
and you can't live in either world too long. Like you have
Correct.
to be able to live in both.
And an education should
Yeah.
allow you to do both.
Yeah.
You know, to be able to watch a movie and dissect it on the one hand, and also go keep your job so that
Yeah.
you can go buy shoes or something,
Of course.
and pay your rent. You know,
Kind of a Eastern/Western two mindsets. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? What you're describing is more Eastern,
yeah,
where the Western kind of probably errs a lot of times on not enough romanticism.
not enough
and
romanticism.
too much
But you
just-
know what? Life is about building death. That's what the philosopher Montaigne said. Life is about building a good death. And if you've never been thoughtful or a romantic or read poetry, you're missing out on a lot. But I do begin with that ability of economic viability.
Yeah.
Right? Because if you're not even economically viable, how much philosophy
You
are
can
you going to
never
read?
get there. Yeah, you can never get
Yeah.
there. So you go to BYU.
Yes.
When did you meet your husband?
I met my husband at Harvard.
Okay. So
yeah,
later.
not at BYU. Yeah, I was a failure at BYU. An utter failure. All my roommates got married. I didn't.
So you went to BYU. You studied Russian literature at BYU.
I did, and international relations.
Did you
I had
love
a
it?
double major. I loved it. Again, like I said, I was a romantic and all that reading when I was a kid, you know, and to discover some of the greatest writers, Chekhov, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, just opened another whole new world for me. And those are asking all the deepest questions of life. I think that's what I got from studying Russian literature. And I also joke about it. It helped me to pick up a very thick book and distill it into one page. And I tell students at UVU, if you can have the skill of distilling the essence or synthesizing the essence of ideas into one page, any CEO in the country will hire you.
Wow.
CEOs have no time to think. And if you could distill any tough topic today, AI, and write a 1 to 3 page memo, you're
Wow,
hired.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
I've literally never thought about that, but I think about that in practice.
Yeah.
And how important it is to have somebody within an organization, for me, that can take a complex problem and make it simple and come with actionable solutions. It really is like the ultimate form of, you know, taking the complex and making it simple. I think that is sophistication. That's kind of a higher level of sophistication.
It's an ultimate skill, and you can apply it to any area. And so that explains a lot of my career. You know, so I've worked in philanthropy, academia. I worked on Wall Street for 4 years. I've worked in technology for Microsoft. I've worked in peace negotiations on behalf of the U.S. government in the southern Philippines. And so it's that same skill I've applied every single
Wow.
time, taking something big and complex and asking, you know, what are the implications for action and what are the results that you can expect on the other end. And even for running UVU, I think I still apply that every single day because I was not trained or I am not an experienced university administrator. I have some experience, but I've never been a provost.
Yeah, you came more from the business world, right?
Yes, I was 6 years at Microsoft as a regional director for corporate, external, and legal affairs in Southeast Asia before
Wow.
coming to UVU.
So you went to Harvard. You go to the business school?
No, I did a master's in Soviet studies.
Okay, so it was still,
I'm a hardcore
so it was
Soviet
still,
expert.
I was going to say you're still on that.
Yes, Russia and the former Soviet Union.
That's like a whole completely different topic about like the world today.
Yes, so I
Which
lived
I'm
in fact
so
in
fascinated
Russia
in.
for 2 years. You know, running a project for Harvard University. I speak fluent Russian.
Wow.
So that was a gigantic part of my early career.
I just want to go there, but I want to stay on track.
We're not going to discuss Russia, Ukraine today.
So like maybe like let's just go there. Like your deep experience with Russia. Walk me through in simple terms why the war has happened. What led us to this point? Why is Ukraine so important to Russia?
A lot of that, of course, is very historical. There are historically deep roots, and perhaps the more precipitating factor is the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And if you remember, you may not remember, you're young.
I was too young. I've studied it, but I don't remember it.
So, you know, the Soviet Union was the continuation of what was the Russian Empire, one of the most powerful, biggest empires in the world today. the breakup of the Soviet Union happened in 1991, and you see a country, a giant empire, shrink to its borders of roughly 1725 under Peter the Great, maybe. So it shrank, and I think for great empires, whether you're talking about the French Empire, the British Empire, the American Empire, the Spanish Empire, there have been many empires. It's very, very difficult to lose your empire and your territory. And there's a lot of great power thinking. So I guess to me, from a macro perspective, that great power thinking never left Russia. And then you have sort of these precipitating variables, the personality of Putin.
Yeah.
I mean, Putin definitely is a goon, in my opinion. And even though his rhetoric didn't start out so imperialistic, eventually, he never gave up power. He's held on to power since 2000. And has been kind of intent on restoring the glory of the former Soviet Union. So the empire broke up, thankfully, peacefully.
Yeah, which is incredible.
You have to give Mikhail Gorbachev credit for that, and also others who were helpful in in that relatively peaceful breakup of empire. But I think the loss of power was a huge blow. And then the expansion of NATO was a huge blow. I was, in fact, involved in face-to-face conversations between American leaders, European leaders, and Russian leaders in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet Union, where the Russians were still saying, can we get into NATO also? And the answer was a slap to their faces. The answer was never. And so I think the security structures weren't there either. So these are all like different factors, but it makes a huge difference as to whether you have a Gorbachev in power or a Putin in power.
Yeah.
And the brutality of, and frankly also because they were under the illusion, the Russians, that this was going to be a quick operation. And it turned not to be a quick operation because Ukrainian statehood had evolved. And if anything, the invasion of Ukraine further strengthened Ukrainian identity.
Yeah.
And Zelensky suddenly stepped up to being a whole different kind of leader. And the Western coalition in many ways held. That's so important because without a Western coalition supporting Ukraine couldn't have prosecuted the war.
There's something about that particular war that just has been so fascinating to me, outside of tragic, but fascinating on the miscalculation of Putin.
Yeah.
And I remember reading they had their ceremonial uniforms packed up. It was part of they thought it was going to fall in 3 days.
They were planning, and then they would have this victory.
Yeah, they're planning the celebration in Kyiv.
Yeah.
And it just didn't happen. And it's two years plus later, and there's kind of no end in sight. How does this end?
So before I say how it ends, the miscalculation happens because when you have an authoritarian leadership or a dictatorship, normally the subordinates are afraid to tell the truth.
Yeah.
So no one will ever tell you, hey, it's a bad idea because
that confirmation
they're afraid.
bias.
Confirmation bias.
Exactly.
So how is this going to end? I think, sadly, I think we still have ways to go. And all wars end at the negotiating table.
Yeah.
So at some point,
that's where
depending on the losses that both sides are willing to take, this will end at the negotiating table. And the question becomes, how do you redraw the borders?
Yeah.
Which territory stays with whom? And then how does the Western alliance, if you will, provide for the integrity, the territorial integrity of Ukraine?
Because it feels
and
would
Russia ever accept?
It feels like there's been some fundamental shifts that are just never going back, specifically with Finland and Sweden joining NATO through this process. Those are fundamental changes.
Correct. They'd never joined NATO during the Cold War.
And have had a lot of chances, that were, and had never chosen that path and chose that path because of these circumstances. And then you take, anyway, completely different topic, a topic that for me, I have this interesting fascination with. And so for me, hearing that Russian studies has been such a big part of your life. It's just something I didn't know.
Yeah, I had an 11-year career. In fact, I recommend you read my book on Russia.
I need to do it. Let's go.
It's called Russian Nationalism Since 1856, Ideology and the Making of Foreign Policy. And you learn a lot about Russian diaspora and all of these triggers for what might lead Russia to go to war and behave in more aggressive ways.
So like you've like known this is coming for a long time.
Not necessarily known. And the book is old now. It was published in 2000. But I remember when the war happened, the invasion happened, I was just sick to my stomach. And I looked at the epilogue to the book. And I actually wrote in there in a sentence that if Putin's rapacious behavior in Chechnya was any sign of things to come, we should all be very worried. I wrote something to that effect.
Prophetic.
Because he was so brutal. The war he prosecuted in Chechnya was so brutal. And things including like the bombing of apartment buildings in Moscow, which people still believe that he had something to do with that. It was an excuse then to, really brutalize Chechnya. So personalities in leadership matter. Like I said earlier, it matters when you have a Gorbachev versus when you have a Putin, how... Or in Syria, Assad. Leaders can kill tens of thousands or 1 million of their own population. Stalin killed tens of millions and get away with it and still stay in power. So it really depends. You have to choose your leaders very carefully.
I mean, you're taking me places that I don't go. Like this isn't a place that my mind, my mind's a simple mind, and I'm thinking about how to go operate on a task or how to, change my kid's stinky diaper. And so like to go. Anyway, but I love this stuff. So I'm going to get back on track. You go to Harvard, you graduate from Harvard, and then you just still your heart, you just had the desire to continue down your academic journey.
Yes. So after Harvard, I had the opportunity to do my PhD in political science at MIT, which is just down the street.
Yeah.
But I stayed on at Harvard as a fellow. I was a fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. And basically my main responsibility there was working on a project that was in Moscow, actually, towards the tail end of the Soviet Union and then the early post-Soviet
So at that
period.
point in life, that was when all the action was taking place.
Yes.
Yes. That had to have been so exciting for you to have that be your course of study and then to see history happening in front of your eyes.
Absolutely. So I had a front seat to one of the most exciting periods in world history. I had the chance to meet with Gorbachev 4 times. I became very good friends with the foreign minister,
How did I not know this? This is incredible. How cool is this?
I have pictures to prove it. I became an advisor to the first chief judge of the first Russian constitutional court.
I had no idea. This is incredible.
Yeah, it was actually very formative. So I was in my 20s. I got married at 23, and then I left my husband in New York so I could work in Moscow.
You're like mid-20s.
Yeah.
In the heart of this stuff.
Yeah, and I negotiated a deal with Harvard that they would buy me a business class ticket every 6 weeks so I could visit my husband in New York City.
Wow. Business class.
Yeah. I was still in my 20s, but I thought, I deserve this. They should, because it's such a hard job. Moscow sometimes had, these were the days of long, long lines when Moscow's market wasn't developed. Communism was already dying or dead. And my husband was starting his career as a lawyer, as a litigator in New York City, one of the biggest law firms. So it was the perfect time in our lives. We were just running 100 miles an hour, and we were both extremely gung-ho about life and work and loved each other's careers, and we loved each other. Everybody thought we were getting divorced, especially at church, but people don't get that we were so committed to each other. That's why we could live apart. So I had a front seat to the implosion of one of the most gigantic empires the world had ever known. Yeah.
Man, that's incredible. Your story is incredible. You're firing me up. You're pumping me up. I'm loving this. So you were doing that while you're going to MIT.
Yes, while I was doing my PhD.
And they were all just like on board. They're
Yeah,
like,
well,
this
but
is
what I'd done at MIT, I was very, very efficient. In 2 years, I did my general exams. So when you do your general exams, you're a free agent after that because all you need is really to write your thesis. And at that point, I wasn't sure what was happening with the Soviet Union. It felt like it was going to fall apart. And for
and
me
you
to
just couldn't miss it. You just
yes, and I also then didn't want to write a thesis on the Soviet Union because I had started. And then I thought it's going to fall apart and it's going to be Russia and it's going to be a different world. So I was waiting. In a way, I was biding my time. Like, what's going to happen?
to see how it played out.
To how it played out. And I ended up writing a thesis on Russian nationalism, which is much more interesting than a thesis on, I started one on Soviet policy in the third world.
And it would kind of be irrelevant.
It would have been irrelevant.
Yeah,
it would have been, nobody would read it.
Yeah.
But a thesis on Russian nationalism is a lot more interesting.
Oh, especially now.
Yeah, and I was able to publish the book fairly quickly. So I already was working on Wall Street when I published my book.
And so how do you go from like in the middle of this political storm, if you will, to I'm going to go and work on Wall Street? Those are really different paths.
So there's still a big interregnum before Wall Street because after Russia, I actually worked in New York City in philanthropy. I worked for Carnegie Corporation of New York.
Yeah.
And they had a gigantic grant program on everything related to democratic reform, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, and economic reform in the former Soviet and Eastern European communist countries.
Still on that same,
still very much
same theme
correct.
Of kind of where you had done a lot of your formal education.
Yeah, so I worked for them for 6 years, and we were working with Harvard, MIT, Brookings, the top think tanks, the Council on Foreign Relations. And what we were essentially doing at the time was extremely interesting because we've never had an experience of seeing an empire implode or a communist system implode. So in the wake of that, what do they need in terms of, economic reform, democratic reform, police reform, local government reform? Also, we were very worried at the time that missiles, nuclear material, fissile material would simply be bought by terrorists. But I think we were actually overhyping it. But at the time, it was so natural to worry about it. Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine had been denuclearized. So in a way, you only had to worry about one nuclear power, Russia. But then at the time, when they were so poor and everything was imploding, we were thinking, what if they started selling
nuclear,
missiles or fissile material for that matter to terrorists or rogue countries? And so there was a lot of very interesting work to be done in nuclear non-proliferation. So I was in the heart of all that for 6 years, as well as like market reform. And frankly, again, I think some of it was naive in hindsight. Markets don't just happen overnight.
Yeah.
And just because you say you privatize a Soviet factory,
there's got to be just this idealism that it's just going to fix. That's
right.
You put in this...
Like the fall of communism was suddenly going to open to all good things.
Yeah.
It's a very American way of thinking, and it's very naive.
Yeah.
Social systems take forever to be created.
And that culture are like they just don't change very quickly.
They don't change. Yeah. Your history, your DNA.
I remember hearing the stories of East and West Germany and this integration, and how especially the elder generation, they just didn't like it that much. Even though, it's better, it's just not what they were comfortable with.
And it wasn't better for many people. We seem to misunderstand that people in the Soviet and communist days, they were provided for from birth to grave. They had savings of 10, 20 years that became worthless overnight. You would have a revolution in America if Texas became a separate state, New York became a separate state. If you're in Utah and you now need a passport to visit your mom in Texas and you saved money for 20 years and suddenly it's worth only $100.
So hard.
You would have a revolution, and that's what
would.
happened there.
Yeah.
And their life expectancy, like men started dying at 50, 52. Like alcoholism became even worse than it already was. So we seem to forget. This is what I mean when I say naivete. Social and political and economic systems take a long time to change. Meanwhile, people are losing all their social safety nets and everything they've worked for and everything familiar to them. So you see that millions actually died from the end of communism because of stress, alcoholism, and violence also.
I can't imagine how stressful that would be. Specifically, if you don't have the coping skills or if you don't have the skills to actually function, in theory, you're even more dependent.
Correct. You're even more dependent. You're helpless. I mean, my friends were lining up 6 hours for sugar. Try that in America. Try having Americans line up 6 hours for sugar, for a kilo of sugar, and see if you don't have people shooting one another.
It had to be so hard for you too because it was human and it was personal.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching it.
It's significantly different when it's out there. It's someone, it's across the world, but when it's human, it's personal, and you've got names and birth dates and relationships with the people who are experiencing it. It changes everything.
Yeah, and there was just a lot of violence. And then people could see that some people got very, very rich. There's a reason, there's a Russian oligarchy, small group of people that all became billionaires. Because at the time, essentially, if you had cash, you could buy anything. You could buy a factory for nothing, cents to the dollar. And meanwhile, the ordinary workers, got nothing.
Yeah.
And so it's like they were betrayed by communism and they were betrayed by capitalism. And it's like, nowhere to go. And Putin, by the way, introduced stability. If you look at what happened to post-Soviet Russia from 2000, he introduced a lot of stability. And he introduced a certain dignity back in Russia where people feared Russia again.
Yeah.
And they could all kind of go about their business. His predecessor, Yeltsin, was drunk almost all the time. And for that reason, he became very popular, And
Putin.
then, Putin. And then, I mean, the war is an altogether different thing. Hundreds of thousands have left. And what happens to Russia after this? It'll be very interesting to see.
Yeah. So how did you get to Wall Street?
So after my 6 years in philanthropy, it was 1998, I decided that I no longer understood what was happening in Russia because I didn't know markets, I didn't know privatization, I didn't know stocks and bonds, and that was all the game in Russia at that time. But I already had a master's, I already had a PhD, and I didn't want to go back to school. So I asked myself, what's the shortest way to learn about money and markets without going back to school and get paid for it? So the answer was investment banking.
Wow.
So this is so hilarious. I knew nothing about investment banking. I talked to one of my best friends was the assistant to Steve Schwartzman of the Blackstone Group. She set up a meeting with Schwartzman and she looked through her Rolodex and introduced me to a gentleman who knew Vikram Pandit at Morgan Stanley. And I went and interviewed there. And interviewed at Goldman as well. And then I interviewed at SBC Warburg because they had bought a Russian bank, a bank in Moscow called Brunswick Warburg. They bought 50% of it. I got 2 offers, Morgan Stanley and Brunswick Warburg. And because Brunswick Warburg was already in Moscow, I picked that offer, which in hindsight was a mistake. I didn't diversify. I should have gone to the bigger bank, Morgan Stanley. So that's how I got into Wall Street. But within a few months, the Russian market imploded. If you remember, the ruble collapsed. And I found myself without a job. And I thought, my transition to knowing money wasn't over. So I just talked to friends. And one of my friends, who was a trustee for Carnegie Corporation, where I used to work, introduced me to Hank Greenberg of AIG.
I mean, you're talking the names that you're discussing, it's like the masters of the universe.
The masters of the universe.
Yes.
And luckily, I didn't know that Hank was a master of the universe, or I would have been so nervous. And I remember going up to 70 Pine Street, one of the most beautiful Art Deco buildings in the world, and going to his office. And I'm in this gigantic waiting room, and there's a picture on the wall of him with every head of state of the world, basically. And on his table was a beautiful mother of pearl box with a Philippine flag. So I realized he'd met the Marcoses and they'd given him this gift. So I started asking myself, who is this man? And so I went into his office for the big interview. And I was very clear about what I didn't know. But at that point, I knew a little more because for me to have worked at Brunswick Warburg,
had some reps.
I had a Series 7 license. I had Series I had Series 65 as well. So
You just jumped in.
yeah, I just jumped in.
Yeah.
I took those exams, passed the exams. And so I was like, feeling a little bit better that I knew something about the market. But I went in there and he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm writing a book now on Russian nationalism. And Hank Greenberg's family came from Russia. They were Jewish refugees.
Wow.
It was either his grandmother or great grandmother who had to flee, literally with like a cardboard box of belongings. And he tells me the story that grandmother got all her 10 siblings, a lot of siblings out of Russia. And then when he went to meet Gorbachev in the Kremlin, he tells Gorbachev this story. And he said, Mr. Gorbachev, I've come to Moscow in my private plane. Which system do you think is better? Like, that was such a great story. And anyway, the end of that interview, he says to me, okay, he said, you don't understand numbers. You have to learn numbers. So he gives me a job on the spot and assigns me to credit risk.
Wow. So you're like going like right into like
I'm
the
just
hardcore.
like, I don't know what credit risk is.
And you're how old?
I was probably 33. Maybe in my early 30s.
So it always inspires me. Like where I get inspired is when I see leaders or people that are willing to start over.
Yeah.
And it's humbling.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Because when you're strong, when you've worked at something, you get a strength and you get confidence. And so to go start over, you just have to be bad before you're good. And
I was so bad.
And it takes a level of humility to say, yeah, I'm okay getting on this track because this is going to take me to where I want to go. How did you have like the maturity / conviction to know I'm willing to go take this hard road because it will take me somewhere?
Well, I think one thing that's so important is to admit what we don't know. I think we get in trouble when we pretend we know something but don't really know it. So I was very upfront about the things that I didn't know. And in fact, in credit risk, the first assignment that I got was really rating sovereign obligors. So AIG, like all other big firms, subscribed to Moody's and Fitch and S&P. So they had all those ratings, but they wanted their in-house ratings also on the credit worthiness of different entities. So they assigned me banks and countries. Why? Because I was a political scientist, and a political scientist could look at countries and actually look at not only the numbers, but the general economics, the policy situation in this country. So I could do that. I could do Poland. But part of me really felt like an imposter. Like, what am I doing here? And then it evolved from that to banks. And I took a lot of classes at the World Trade Center. AIG paid for all of it. I had to learn, how to analyze corporate financial statements. I took a class on risk finance. And then eventually, after 1 year, Mr. Greenberg said, you can pick anything at AIG and it'll be fine with me. So I picked private equity. So I ended up...
How did you have just this special relationship with him where he basically just opened up everything to you? Like, how did you make that connection?
I think it was the interview, so just interviewing really well and persuading him that even though there were things I didn't know.
But he had to have known like you were special or believed you were special.
I think he did. And, he had the vice chair, Frank Wisner, who'd been an ambassador to Egypt, India, Zambia, the Philippines. He had Frank Wisner interview me also. And Frank just really, really believed in me. And I think that helped. Plus, the person who introduced me to Mr. Greenberg in the first place, his name is Vincent May, also had a great relationship with Hank. And Hank knew I was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. It's very hard to become a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and he was the chair there. So he probably connected the dots and knew that I was a good political scientist, and and I was a very hard worker.
I can see that. I
that's
can
one
like
thing.
if I'm seeing trends,
yeah,
I'm seeing that anything that you put your mind to, you just outwork everybody else.
It is true. I'm like
a beautiful trait.
I'm a workaholic. I used to resist that, but I've totally embraced that.
But you love it. Like you love it. It's just like a superpower. Yeah.
My safe space is working.
Yeah.
I love working. I feel good when I'm working. I sleep well at night when I put in a long day's work. So and the working is part of that. Is like you have to be credible. I mean, when I went into private equity, I didn't know the terminology. And then I picked biotechnology, which is a very difficult field.
Very difficult.
And so I was having my initial meetings. In one of my first meetings, someone mentioned the word apoptosis as they're presenting their company. It's a startup.
You have no idea what it means.
I'm sitting there. I have no idea what it means. And I'm totally embarrassed to ask because that's normal. You get so embarrassed. And it was that moment for me where I decided, don't freak out. Go take classes. So I signed up to audit 2 courses at the new school in New York, one on neuroscience and another one on molecular biology. So I was just auditing. There was no pressure to get a grade, but I had to pick up terminology.
You were always just hungry to learn. So my wife right now, she's been full-time mom.
Yeah.
And she's going back to do her MBA.
Wow.
And part of the process is she's doing this Harvard core skills course.
Yeah.
And she's doing hardcore accounting and finance and stats and she's loving it, but it's humbling for her because the terminology and the language is just it's a foreign language.
Correct.
And we're talking through it and she's putting in so much work and we're talking through it at night. And I can see her almost like struggling with this. On one hand, she's loving the growth.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's humbling to realize that she's starting from zero and she's learning these skills. And so it's fun to hear your story about just embracing that process and just saying, I'm going to work my way until I am competent, until I am credible, until I do have my arms around these topics.
Yeah, Chelsea will do very well. You just have to embrace the discomfort. And I think, I speak several languages. And I've always told students when I teach them language that if you're not willing to make a fool of yourself, you're not going to succeed. And I think it's true with everything else. It's not making a fool of yourself in a stupid way. It's making a fool of yourself in that you're willing to admit, I don't know, and that I will make mistakes. But that I can master it. And so achieving a certain level of mastery, both in speaking finance and in biotech, where I could use the word apoptosis and not feel weird about it,
It just feels like you have a capability to learn and relearn, unlearn and relearn. And I think that has probably been the reason you've been able to have the career that you've had.
Yeah.
Because they're so different. These skills and these tracks are so different. Mm-hmm. And I would say the majority of people aren't willing to do that. That restarting and repositioning and the work that it takes to get up to a level of competency that you can actually be at the table and be credible is hard.
I mean, that's one way to run a career. The other way is to say, I'm going to be a cardiothoracic surgeon.
And specialize.
And so you specialize, and both ways are valid.
Yeah.
And I actually joke, but I think it's true that I have attention deficit. I think I have attention deficit and I can get slightly manic. But then what I do with my mania and my attention deficit is just use that for my benefit. Because I'm so curious about so many things. And I think curiosity is another important skill to have, or a character to have, a character trait. To be curious. If you meet somebody who's an electrician or somebody who is an artist, be curious.
But I think that's one of the things, again, that I'm observing. I'm taking these notes, these leadership notes. Mm-hmm. And I think what endears people to you is that you're curious about them, that you get interested in them, whether it's an electrician or a wrestler and I think that curiosity is a superpower.
Yeah.
Because it's also couples with empathy.
Yes.
And I care enough to listen and to get curious, where the opposite of that is pride and not caring. And it's kind of, being so caught up in your own career and your own achievements.
Or your own importance.
Yeah.
Believe me, I have no illusions about my importance. None.
But from the outside looking in, like, I've always been impressed with you, but I'm way more impressed with you now, talking to you for an hour. Like, I'm listening and I admire the journey that you've been on, but I admire the human connection skills that are not the hard skills, they're the soft skills, but I also, in my personal business experience, end up being the most important skills.
Yeah.
To be able to influence people, you have to listen and you have to get curious.
Yeah.
And that curiosity outside of, the professional realm, but just in people, it's just, it's a admirable quality that you have. And I don't know if it was natural or if it's developed, but it's obviously something that has made you, even where you're at today in academia and running a university, that's a completely different track than public relations. That's or from working in Russia, and it's a completely different track than Wall Street, and definitely from Microsoft. You know what I mean?
But all of those other things, they kind of all come together.
Yeah.
And I think the curiosity about people, it is both natural and learned. It's hard, I think, for everybody, like, not to just like listen to ourselves or listen to ourselves talk. But I find that, when you talk to people, you do learn a lot. So when I've talked to students in my first year at UVU, we have a series called Wolverine Stories, born out of the fact that every time I ran into a student in the corridor, they would tell me a story that I would find riveting.
Yeah.
And, yesterday I had lunch with our Black Student Union, and around that table in the trustees room at UVU, you had students from Nigeria, Uganda, Texas, the Democratic Republic of Congo. You cannot sit there and not be riveted by the diversity of experience. Some of them, a couple are African American, one from Haiti, and then some are refugees. If you have any curiosity, like, you would sit there and like, wow, tell me all about you guys, and how are you finding UVU? Because suddenly they're all there at UVU.
Yeah.
I think it's very rewarding in that sense too. And maybe that comes from my Russian literature background. Everybody has a story.
Yeah. Oh, it's beautiful. So talk to me about Microsoft. How do you go from Wall Street to jumping into the corporate world?
So Microsoft, I'd already had those 10 years on Wall Street. And then again, in the interim, I actually lived in Hong Kong for 3 years. So it was more academic in Hong Kong. I was working on a peace process in the southern Philippines that had been commissioned by President George Bush and President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, because they were so worried after 9/11 about Al-Qaeda infiltration of the Muslims of the southern Philippines. And the Muslims there are called Moros, and they've had a multi-century like rebellion and insurgency because they've never fit into a Christianized country. So I had that, and then my family moved to Singapore because my husband's job, he was the head of structuring for structured credit products at HSBC. And you know what happened in 2008. It nearly took the whole world down. So my husband's name is Jeff. So we moved to Singapore, where he took a job with a hedge fund. And I actually had a job offer from Google. But over 6 months of interviews, I found them so arrogant that I did not accept the job. And I ended up going to the National University of Singapore and worked as a vice dean for the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. After 4 years of...
Was that your first kind of foray into education?
I had worked for Harvard.
Okay.
So this is sort of my
fellow,
second
right?
as an academic. It's my first as an academic administrator. Okay. So started in executive education, then became the vice dean of research. And after 4 years of that, academia has its dysfunctions like everything else. I kind of got tired of it. And when Google had offered me the job in 2008, Microsoft was also talking to me when they heard that Google was about to hire this woman. So they were talking to me. And I didn't pursue it at the time, but after 4 years in National University of Singapore, I just phoned Microsoft. I said, hey, I'm looking for change. They were amazing. And I think they were amazing because they'd been humbled as a company. The stock price hadn't moved.
Yeah, they weren't in a, you look at Microsoft today, and that's a very different position.
It's a very different company.
Yeah.
So their stock price hadn't moved from $32 forever. And Steve Ballmer was still there, doing his big rah-rah. But because of the way they treated me, one of the things is to like the people you work with. I was impressed by that they, that they weren't like Google. They were humble. They were humbler. And so I picked Microsoft. And at the time, Vanity Fair had on its cover the lead article, How Microsoft Lost Its Mojo.
Right, when you chose them. Wow.
But it was a brilliant move on my part in hindsight. I like the people, and I thought, I could learn. So earlier you said, you talked about how hard it is. Like, I have a learning mindset to transition. By far, this was a harder transition than the Wall Street transition
Wow.
because I did not understand the language of tech at all. And I had no office. They gave me a locker. And I didn't know how to use, Skype for business. And I remember the first 6 months, I cried a lot because I felt stupid. Plus, I was running a team of lawyers, and I was not a lawyer. And some of them didn't like me, that their boss was not a lawyer. So my imposter syndrome was times 10 because now I'm overseeing compliance, legal, commercial support, government affairs, philanthropy. Those things I could handle very well. I was an expert in government affairs and philanthropy, but the rest of it, not. And you have to stick with something. This is an advice I would give to everyone. If you've made a decision, stick to it for at least six months. Even a marriage, if you don't think it's working, give it 6 months. Because in 6 months, you'll have an epiphany whether you can carry on or not. So I gave it 6 months, and after 6 months, I was in. I understood what they were saying.
You settled in.
I said, and I began to understand what it was about, And then it was just a terrific, really 6 years. I felt like I learned so much, and I had a front seat when Satya Nadella took over and witnessed how you could actually reshape a gargantuan tech company and then release value like you've never seen in your life, to make it what it is today.
One of the most, if not the most valuable company in the world. I mean, that transition has just been so meteoric. That rise.
Oh my gosh, it's unbelievable. And one of the things, I got a chance to actually host Satya Nadella in 3 of my markets, Indonesia, Thailand, and Singapore. And I remember one of the smartest things I heard from him. He said, you have to have your own intelligent view of what's happening in the tech market. You have to know who you are and what your strengths are. And then 3, then you have to run with it. And he made very tough decisions at the beginning, just lopping off lines that weren't yielding anything, just lop them off to the tune of billions of dollars of write-offs. And people who were at Microsoft forever who were so entitled. I mean, I witnessed these people at work. They were entitled. They didn't get my markets. They would fly in and think, they knew better than the Vietnamese.
Yeah, of course.
It was bad attitude all around. So that kind of cleanup in leadership is also necessary. That you need to know who you are. For Utah Valley University, that's a message that I try to convey. We need to know who we are. We're not trying to be BYU or the University of Utah. We know where we are in the market.
Yeah.
And we're going to play to that. We're going to play to our strengths and deliver. And I think, that's a lesson I learned from Microsoft.
So I know that you have time constraints. I'd love to go like literally forever because this is so fascinating for me. But I've got one more question.
Okay.
Before we finish up. Tell me, and we're missing just parts. We're missing how you came to UVU and how you actually factored that decision to say, I want to come do this and coming back to Utah. But tell me the university and your 5 years there. What have you learned? What's the most profound thing that you've learned? And the second question is where is the university going?
Okay, that's a great question to end on. So I've been president of UVU for just over 5 years. And even before I started the job, my philosophy about work has never changed. It's about people and culture every single time. You have to create people and culture. The rest of it, strategy and execution, follow. So the first thing, I think that the most important thing I did is to call out what our values are going to be: exceptional care, exceptional accountability, and exceptional results. Because we are an open admission university, you have to begin with care. You have to know that you have students who are 4.0 and students who barely passed high school, or students who were bullied, or non-traditional students who are freshmen at the age of 50. So you have to have exceptional care. But, care is insufficient. Exceptional accountability is bringing our best selves to work, using our resources very well, stop complaining, do the work, give feedback, take feedback and give feedback. And exceptional results, that's retention, completion, jobs for our students. And we are running on all cylinders and succeeding. So today in the fall, our enrollment is 44,653.
Which is just insane to me.
Yeah, our retention rate is 70%, the highest it's ever been between freshman and sophomore year. Our completion rate, the 8-year IPEDS number, is at 46%. That is way above average, way above average for open admission institutions. And we are a year ahead of schedule because that was our goal for 2025. When you look at employment, our class of 2021, 83% employed, and 77% of our alumni are still here in Utah 10 years out. So I like to underline that UVU students are Wolverines. They're the families of Utah, the voters of Utah, the workers of Utah.
Yo.
Every dollar invested in us is a dollar invested in the future.
I love that sales pitch. I really do, because for Chelsea and myself, we're both Wolverines.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And
Go Wolverines.
When I teach at BYU, and we have a lot of ties to BYU, but ultimately, like, our education, our experience was Utah Valley.
Yeah.
And I don't think I could have got into BYU. I didn't have the grades, and I didn't have the upbringing to be able to get into that school. And so, like, for me, kind of the other side of the tracks, and having that be a landing spot for me was, foundational. If I wouldn't have came to UVU, I would not have started this unconventional track that I, went on, that ended up being in a, kind of the perfect fit for me. And so we love the school. And honestly, we love you. We cheer for you always from the sidelines. And we love seeing your wins. And I love great leadership. I'm an admirer of exceptional leaders, and I think that you're an exceptional leader. And I think the school and the state is so lucky to have you, and we're eager to be more helpful and to kind of help you execute on that vision. So anyway, thank you so much for coming and taking some time with me today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Yep. We'll see ya.